But if somebody were to like spend, a full-time job's worth in debate, like I think that like Paul right now could probably wax us, and I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt, Gabe.
I appreciate that. It means a lot.
But like I don't
That's
know.
this video is gonna be 7 seconds long when we release it. Boom. It's recording. Proteus Debate Academy. Another one coming at you. It's been a long time since we did something that wasn't that video I did the other week on judging philosophies.
I haven't put out anything in like a year. Since I started my new job.
I feel like you made that like movies for debate video, and
then I was just like, I'm done. I'm done with the channel. What else? I've said everything I had to say.
It's a great video, by the way.
Thank you. Oh my God.
The best part really is when you do the like, you have Sabine doing like the Marissa.
I had to do a reenactment of My Cousin Vinny.
Have you seen this video, Ali? Are you aware?
No, I have not.
Sasan made a video that's called like the films I show my debaters. And
so I wanted to do a clip from My Cousin Vinny, but of all of the movies, that one kept getting flagged for like copyright stuff.
Right.
So I was like, all right, what if I just like flip the video? And then I tried it again, flagged. And I was like, okay, so what if I just like draw what's happening, but then use the original audio? And it was like, still doesn't like it. So I ended up dubbing the scenes myself with my partner and
drawing them.
And drawing. It has nothing to do with debate or really anything. I haven't really met.
Yeah, I was gonna say we're really bad hosts. If people want to introduce themselves, Alex, I don't know if you want to start.
Yeah, Alex, why not? You're self-doxing today.
Oh yeah, shit. Oh, can I not swear? Oh god.
You can swear.
Okay.
Swear. Do whatever you want, bro. No one's getting paid.
Yeah. It's like a no parents, no rules situation.
Yeah, maybe no rules. I don't know. Well, I'm Alex. Half of Oregon GL. Gabe's the other half. I don't know what more is.
Well,
there.
You spoiled Gabe's introduction now, D.
Yeah, I was the PM CMO.
Cool. Gabe.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was Alex's partner.
Oh, why don't you introduce them?
Okay, cool. Yeah, I get. Well, Ali,
they're way too humble to say.
Yeah. Okay. Anywho, so this is Alex and Gabe. When I've all these videos where I've been like, the boys in Oregon without saying their names. These are the boys from Oregon, better known as the 2022 NPTE national champions from Oregon. And in fact, for those of you who don't know, we have the 2022 NPTE top speaker, the 2020 NPTE top speaker. And Ali, were you 16 or 17?
I think 2016.
16 top speakers. So we have 3 NPTE top speakers, all from Oregon in various capacities. So that Alex and Gabe, very successful team, were ranked 1 all season long, won one of the natties, and then they made the terrible mistake of letting me prep them at the other one. It didn't go so great. Easily their worst performance of the year. I don't know what could have caused it. And then in the bottom on my screen, bottom frame, which I guess since I'm the one recording it, that's where it'll be. That is Alyson Escalante, who was really, really, really good at debate, is very, very smart. I've mentioned Ali a bunch of times in like videos about like role models for debate, people who I just think are sick, like rounds I tell people to watch. A lot of them have Ali in them. But Ali also, like, it's so weird because like I think of you as like Ali's just like that, like, really, really good NPTE debater, like everyone knows and whatnot. But now your big thing seems to be just like you're like the voice of Marx for debate at this point somehow, which I think is awesome. And I don't mean that in like somehow like a bad way, but like I was telling you in Discord today, literally my students are judging at the like fake Parli TOC they host in California, and like half of the rounds people are just reading your shit, and you got like literally name dropped today. Like they were like, well, Alyson Escalante is a really good example of like what you could do with debate, which apparently has become a software engineer.
Yeah, it turns out.
Those who don't know. But in many respects, I would say, and Ali also coached the boys here, but in many respects, I would say Ali's biggest accomplishment is there's a band called Antimony, and it has exactly
She's the
one
only one
fan.
that's listened to
And
it.
she's the only person who's listened to it.
Dude, ending 4, pretty sick with that.
Right.
intro on it, gotta say.
Yeah, if our 3 viewers are wondering why I didn't make videos for a year, I was recording a black metal album with one fan.
I was telling them this, but like I messaged Sasan. I was like, hey, there's like the schedules are lining up, everything. Is there any chance you could be there? Ali's gonna be there. Gabe and Alex are gonna be there. And he goes, is Ali the one who likes Antimony? And I was like, yes. He's like,
I'll be there.
I'll fucking make it work. So that's them. It's just for the record. Sasan has judged Alex and Gabe once, maybe twice.
Is that
I don't
true?
think he's ever actually. Yeah, you judged them, and I think they have a bone to pick with that. So
Did you pick up?
Yeah, we
They,
will.
they did.
Well, oh, come on! You picked up, and you're like, yeah, but it wasn't for the right reason.
First off, I was there when this, like, I was outside the window because you were at the office, Sasan, and you were just for like literally a solid.
Oh, I
like,
remember this now. I remember
like
this now.
9 minutes. You're explaining to these two how to collapse.
I don't know.
And like I am just dying, like watching this.
Okay, that's something I think about a lot. Like when you're a judge and you're judging around and they're like, okay, what's your RFD? It's like, what? Like, I'll tell you if you won, is that enough? And it's like, no, explain to us why we won. And it's like, all right, man, like, here's why I think you won. And then it's just like, well, that doesn't really track. Or like I'm trying to like give some feedback that makes sense. I don't know. You're just trying to explain like I paid attention to the round. I just 98% of it was just like shit that was like irrelevant to my experience as a judge. Which
Well,
is
I'm
something
pretty
I think
sure
we're gonna talk about as we get more into Marx and all that. Because it's just like every time Marx comes up in debate, I'm like, you either win automatically or you lose automatically. Like, like I've never seen it be like a substantive clash.
So we haven't even mentioned this yet. This is like we're gonna see how this gets cut or whatever because we don't normally cut shit. But
Good to know.
the way I've explained to people is I want this to be at least 50% Marx in debate, Marx in general, because obviously we have Ali, and Ali is one of the co-hosts on Red Menace, which is easily the sickest Marxist, like leftist podcast out there on the Revolutionary Left Radio YouTube channel. I will just admit, and I wanted to disclose this. So like, there's levels to this shit, obviously, like debate in general, but certainly like cap debate, Marx debate, and like the levels are like Sasan, very little interest. Not that he doesn't know about Karl Marx, but very little interest in Cap K's. Never read a Cap K.
I'm not even unsympathetic to the cause.
Yeah.
I just like I don't get it as a debate argument.
Right.
And
then
that's not
there's
yeah.
then there's me and my kids. This last year, that was their shit. They loved it. A lot of it based on Ali stuff. I've told Ali this, but like when my student Tristan, who had a lot of success with Brenna this year, when I first met her, I was like fresh out of community college. I was telling them like about like K's in debate and whatnot. And they're like, oh, like Marx and stuff, and I'm like, yeah. And I'm like, there's this really sick podcast you got to check out. I'm like, it's called Red Menace. And she goes, Red Menace with Alyson Escalante, and I was like, yes. She's like, you know Alyson Escalante, and I was like, yes, for years. But what I was gonna say is, I have done very minimal reading, like actual reading of Marxist like classic text, let's say. I've done a lot of like articles and stuff from people in the last like 20 years or whatever, because that's kind of like I guess sort of what I've needed. Because I think I've said this before on a Proteus video, but for all of my debate career and coaching, I've read 2 full books ever. Almost always my position was like, the args are out there, people have made these arguments, these cards have been cut, I can talk to other smart debaters, which is very much something that's in like my main strategy. I ask you folks stuff, literally all of you, about your debate thoughts all the time. Because my view is like, look, I've seen debate files. You cut 10 paragraphs from a 300-page book. Why do I need, which is not necessarily the best way to approach something that's so rooted in like historical analysis and like a lot of like knowing what was going on at that moment. Then we get to like Alex and Gabe, who ostensibly have read some Marx stuff, but were very successful debaters reading Cap and answering Cap. Thanks a fucking lot this year. Seems like every time we debated you, you were pretty successful at answering Cap. And then obviously Ali, who's like an OG, like actual, like all of us are kind of posers, I'll be honest, except for Ali when it comes to the Marx thing to a certain degree. I mean, Gabe less so, I guess, you know. But like, I feel like me, Alex, and Sasan are definitely like Marxist posers. So I just wanted to get that out from the beginning. With that said, I actually, because I'm a nerd, I went through like all my Marx notes. I went through like cap Ks and stuff, just thinking about stuff today for a few hours. Because I wanted to ask some like specific questions to like everyone about their take on Marx and debate specifically. And so unless there's anything, just Sasan, is there anything you think we should get out of the way before that? You think?
There's a lot of stuff that I've known of all of you for a long time. We've been like friends by proxy, and I'm looking forward to like getting to know all of you. So I think that'll come. Let's start talking about Marx, and then wherever the conversation goes, it goes. So
the first thing I want to talk about, and again, open to everyone, but when I was thinking of this question, I was actually mostly thinking of Ali and Sasan. The more I've read about like taking one step before we get to Marx, I suppose, about like K literature and K authors in particular, what I have found is that there is a massive overlap between like K authors and film critics and media theorists. Like there's just a massive overlap of like people who are especially in the modern era, like the most famous K authors for debate stuff or whatever, critical literature in general, are very big on like film criticism. And I know, Sasan, obviously you're big on film, and Ali, you're big on everything like the intelligent people are into, which film is covered and K theory definitely is. But I'm just wondering if like you have any thoughts on like why that is and why that tends to be the stuff that filters into debate as opposed to like other stuff. And obviously also Alex, Gabe, whatever you have on that.
Yeah, I mean,
Ali.
Yeah, I'll take a shot real quick. I mean, I think you're right. Like Wilderson obviously comes to mind, but also like if you read No Future, like a huge chunk of what Edelman is doing in there is talking about film. And also like Halberstam, who I don't think is really filtered into Parli as much as policy, but like you do have a lot of people who talk about film and television a lot as their approach. I guess my thought is like, it's kind of a theory that can be applied to media like that is pretty flexible, right? And it tends to be just totalizing enough that you can kind of graft it onto the things we talk about in debate. So when you get into like a lot of political theory that's sort of very niche and focused on just kind of like more specific questions like sovereignty or whatever, if you get in people like Agamben, that's useful for thinking about the state, but it doesn't let us think about broader trends in culture and society necessarily in the way that someone who's analyzing media, which are like these products of society and these products of like cultural ideology, is able to. So I think if I had to make a guess, that's why I think it kind of fits there. It's broad in a way and able to latch on to things beyond just kind of classic political and philosophical questions, which makes it useful for debate because we're not usually actually having those fundamental questions, at least in Parli, at the core of our debates.
Sass, I don't know if
Well, I mean, I think there's some I'm way less tuned into this world, but I think there's something to be said. Obviously, it's criticism, right? And I think criticism and critique as a like field and as a practice is far beyond just Marx or even debate or just sort of like critiques with a K or anything like that, right? Like criticism is a long-standing field and discipline, but I think there is something unique to film and a few other like I guess dead media, like you're not live interacting, and how we approach debate sometimes, which is just sort of like once this thing exists, you get to make a criticism, and that thing at best needs to wait for its turn to respond. Right. So I think we do that in film a lot, which is where, the Shining comes out and you get, if Stanley Kubrick never talks about it, you get 50 years of people saying like, here's what it means. Here's what the issues are. Here's all of this film criticism about The Shining. And nowadays, and it depends on the person making the film, but still at best it's like somebody puts something out and very quickly there is like, here is what this thing you made is and what it entails and what it interacts with, And at best, those authors have to wait for their turn to respond. And I think just mechanically, that's pretty similar to how we approach debate, right? If you have your first speech, or if it's an AF thing, I guess it's whatever the topic is, but it's like this thing exists as an artifact, and we approach it critically, but not in a way that we would in like a dialogue, right? Because we have this like transcript of the debate, and you kind of can't take anything back, and drops and whatever have this strategic and mechanical purpose in the round. So I think it's an interesting thing that I hadn't picked up on, but the connection that I immediately form is this idea that you treat the speech preceding this criticism as this like locked in thing, and at best the other side gets to respond, but in the meantime you get to represent the intent of that advocacy however you're able to, using your literature and the links and all of that stuff, the same way we interpret the intent of movies and books and whatever, which may or may not align with what the author like intended, and who knows if what they intended even matters, right? In debate or in just art, right? Like if you're linking into some problematic issues, like does it matter if you didn't mean to? So that's what I thought of.
On this note, Gabe and Alex, I would say the number one Proteus video we've talked about is the movie one. And you forever ago, months and months ago, maybe even a year ago, you were like, we want to sit down with Sasan, we want to talk movies. So like, you had some opinions. I'm wondering if like in this moment, any thoughts on like film debate, whether that's movies you think are relevant for debate or films you think are relevant to like criticism, or just like things that get you juiced for debate. Just any thoughts on that, so that
I had a list, but it was mostly jokes.
I'm ready. It's more important than what we're really talking about.
That's fair. I don't know. I think to touch on the authors versus films, and I think this is like kind of why films are relevant for debaters. Like I think in the same way that, music or books are also relevant, I think just like film is ubiquitous, which means that you can generate a lot of like cultural understanding or this kind of shared understanding through film. And I don't know if this is maybe because it's like more relevant nowadays. Like I know like Zizek talks a lot about films that are up to date, relevant, talks about the Dark Knight and shit. But those kind of like modern examples I think are useful because they kind of apply to the status quo. Whereas, you think about critiques of Marxism in like the 1900s, like that's less relevant if you're talking about the United States federal government doing things in Ukraine. So I don't know. I think movies are like a good example of some sort of ubiquitous media being up to date.
Gabe, you got any film stuff?
Yeah, I don't have anything to say about that, but I will say that I would show my debaters Top Gun because it teaches you the hedge debate as well as the relationship you should foster with your debate partner.
Absolutely.
Which is the volleyball scene, right?
The volleyball scene, and then like mourning their death.
Yeah.
Never
Sasan,
wanting to do it again.
Well, so quickly, Alex, on what you were saying, I think that's a really interesting and I think resonant idea for me, because film is a really interesting like depiction of culture because it's so expensive to make, as opposed to like books or really any form of like dead media or whatever, where it just kind of exists in one form forever. It costs hundreds of millions of dollars to make, so the people that make it do everything they can to try to get it to resonate with whatever's happening in the culture at the time, right? And every time you or anyone kind of points out a problem with how movies depict certain issues or how they represent certain groups, it's always like, well, that's what the culture sort of buys and consumes and whatever. And I think that's a really interesting point that, the social issues that represent themselves in film tend to also be like major social issues because film tends to like really try to predict what the culture will or won't accept.
That's all I had on movie. Now, actual Marx in general stuff. Unless you guys have Alex,
I
we
do
got a
have one
response.
thing.
Okay.
I think a better movie about the hedge debate is Mean Girls, just because that's my like example to all my students.
Okay.
Anyway, that's all.
Tell me about that.
Solid.
Like Katie
Regina-
versus Regina George. Who's
Yeah.
No, I mean I can piece some things together, but how do you present it to them?
When you sit down with your students for the first time and like, what is hegemony? People are like, oh, I don't know. It's like Regina's the hegemon. That's hegemony. It's like the ability to control what's going on without like being there, and like in some aspects being there.
Sure.
I think it also like paints a pretty interesting picture of like unipolarity versus multipolarity. Whereas like when it's multipolar, like shit's hitting the fan. Like when it's unipolar, like there's people who are sad all the time and there's people who are happy all the time. But when they're like bickering against each other, like no one is safe. Or like, are they? I don't know. I think another interesting parallel within that. Yeah, for sure.
First Cap K question, open for discussion. Anyone can take a bite of this one. Framework or no framework when you're reading the Cap K? Do you think it's necessary or ideal, even strategic, even to read framework when you read a Cap or Marx criticism? Or do you have a different approach, whether that's uniqueness or whatever? I know that if you're a real nerd and you've watched those old like Bellevue debate co-op lectures, Joe Pro said, I think he starts his lecture with, I don't think there's any reason ever to read framework on a Cap K. I've got a lot of Cap K readers here, so I'd love to know your thoughts on that off the top.
I mean, I think it depends on what your Cap K is, right? Like, the thing about Marx and debate is you can take it in a really philosophical direction or like a very grounded, like we're doing guerrilla war, we're doing protracted people's war direction. And that's
which seems to have become the new like hot.
Yeah, it's like super grounded now, I think. Because when I was reading Marx and debate, our links weren't like reformism or anything like that. It was like idealism, right? You give like an idealistic explanation of something, and then like individualism. So we were taking like a very philosophical approach. But even then, thinking back on like the old Oregon Marx shell, like that framework's not actually reading framework arguments, right? I think Sean's joked to you about this before, but it's a bunch of solvency arguments like at the top of that shell about how like coalitions are good and how class lets us build.
It's a secret like disad or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. So even then, like we had a pretty big framework, but it wasn't doing like framework work. But I think if you want to like hit things from the more philosophical side, it's worth going for. And the other thing is, I think a lot of teams have been nesting like these inevitability claims about collapse of capitalism and also about like how dialectics and contradictions are built into reality in their frameworks, which is definitely something you need in there. But even those don't really operate as framework proper, right? Like if we think about the function that they're playing. So of the critiques where you can get away with not having it, I think Marx is definitely one of the ones where it's not as necessary. Again, kind of depending on what direction you go in.
Gabe,
yeah, I would agree with that. I think that in general, the way that I look at K framework, it's either like a trick you're trying to pull, like it's like some sort of frame out, like presumption, something, or it's like alt dis or perm disads or something, or it's like impact framing. And I think that Marx is one of the criticisms that like the impacts don't need a lot of like framing at the top, because usually it's pretty easy to explain why capitalism causes extinction or why dehumanization or any impact you want to go for. That being said, we usually read it with framework just because I think that I think judges like it, and that's kind of it. And I think that like, especially when we were reading a lot of criticisms, it was a lot of Ks were really framework heavy. And I think that kind of shifted how most people thought about the argument.
Something I got turned on to in the last year from just reading like debate related, usually like there's a few like policy blogs I try and read because obviously it seems like Parli's like 3 years, 5 years behind policy at all times and where stuff's going. And there started to be like a big discussion around roll of the ballots and like the distinction between roll of the ballots, which are comparative claims, and roll of the ballots, which are procedural claims, right? Like a roll of the ballot that says vote for the team that best dismantles like capitalism. Like the question becomes like, so are you saying like you must dismantle capitalism to win? Like it's impossible to win unless you do that? Or are you saying that there's like a continuum where like if they can prove dismantling capitalism is bad, is good, or whatever, like it's an impact for them? And I feel like with the cap debate, like that's kind of where I've been seeing a lot of people read those sort of like, I mean, obviously this is kind of a trend in K debate in general, but very self-serving roll the ballots. Not a lot of roll the ballots that are like, we're gonna have a nice even playing field. It's very much like everything but this is lies. And I feel like the classic argument I'm used to saying, and I think my kids are even guilty of this at this point still too, like they're a little, we try to do a little more sophistication or whatever with it these days, but like the big one that used to be the thing, and I remember Henry Tolcher reading this before he went to Berkeley, because him and the Santa Rosa kids were just, super down with it or whatever. But they would read like, and all of their arguments are propaganda, and then like that means just presume for the neg or whatever. And like basically the whole strategy is like, if they drop that, I guess you instantly win. And if they don't, and they just give a thumbs down, that argument goes away. And so that's kind of been my thing with like the framework debate on cap, at least for my kids. What I pretty much have them do at this point is like, if there's like framework stuff, it's mostly just about I suppose usually about like materialism to a certain degree, just because we're trying to preempt like the K, because my kids read a lot of the AF. But other than that, I feel like almost always you're better off going for like the try. I guess what UC Tyler, I would say, made popular ever since 2019 or 2020, whatever year it was when they finaled for the first time. I remember at that tournament, like hearing you talk about it, Ali, that they like, oh wow, yeah, they're just going for like collapse inevitable, it's fascism or it's socialism / communism. And then since then, it feels like that's been the whole thing. But Alex, I feel like I saw your mouth was ready to go before I started talking about that. So I don't know if you have thoughts on the framework on cap or.
So I think they operate differently between the affirmative and the negative. The big thing, we didn't really, I don't know, Gabe, correct me if I'm wrong, but we didn't really read Marx against non-critical strategies on the neg. We might have done it a few times, but I think like a lot of the time, well, I guess we kind of pivoted.
We did it a lot.
Framework. Yeah, okay. I guess we did a lot. I think at least collapsing to it in the MO, the best arguments out of the framework are materialism first, which kind of gets you to if you don't affect the economic base, then like it kind of frames out the affirmative, and like then it kind of comes down to the link work. But I think the bigger thing is on the affirmative, a lot of the framing claims that we have built into our shell are like preempts to framework. So like the arguments that like the only like type of education we should value is revolutionary education and that kind of thing. And they are, for lack of a better place to put those arguments in the framework. So yeah, I think, I mean, Ali was touching on this, but I do think it was, the framework is just kind of like where you put all your preempts. And then at some point you use those preempts, and it's either materialism because they're going to go for Lacan, or it's like, your education is bad because they're going to go for framework.
I want to ask a much more zoomed out question on the same basic idea, which is like, is framework debate real? Like in other words, framework debate seems to be saying, here is how the judge should make their decision, which really what that means is because a decision is not based on just random choices, right? It's based on the arguments that are presented in the round. So what you're saying is, okay, based on the arguments that are presented in the round, you should ignore or emphasize arguments based on this concept or based on this goal, right? But if that argument is true and valid and important, would that normally speak for itself? Like, how much of the framework debate is just sort of trying to, kind of like Alex was saying, sort of like cheat the impact comparison debate, right? Yeah. Another way of saying it is, I teach like middle schoolers who are just starting to do LD. And the first thing they always want to know is like, what like framework should I be reading? What value or value criterion should I be reading? And my answer is always like, if your impact is good, it doesn't matter, right? Like if you're explaining that like, oh, this leads to environmental collapse, like if your opponent's value doesn't account for like all of like life going extinct being bad, like it's just not a good value, right? So I guess applying that more specifically to these kinds of arguments, what role does framework play in these debates in sort of getting around, kind of like Gabe was saying, you know, he was saying, you know, like we don't really need to have these arguments in framework, but so I guess that's kind of the question, right? How much of framework as a argument in debate serves the role of just kind of doing the impact debate in another way, or does it do something else?
I would say, just real quick on that, from the debates I watch, which is different, and I don't mean this in like an old man yelling at cloud way, which is different than how it used to be like for me personally when I debated. I feel like framework debate has devolved in the same way perm debate has, and what I mean by that is I genuinely believe that the A strat for most teams at the highest level for winning like a perm debate is to say one non-explained perm at all and hope the other team drops it. And if the other team can test it, they don't go for it. Because even in debates where I see like one, especially because it's so blocky, which it, you know, to a certain degree, like for the vast majority of debaters is going to be inevitable, because like I really think that is something that separates like really good debaters from not really good debaters, which is like eventually you have to get to a place, and this is difficult for me during my career, where you're off your blocks and like you could just answer anything anyone says to you to a certain degree. But it's like framework debate, this team says stay good, this team says stay bad, and then neither goes for it in the end. They all just go for like cult of offense, like, well, you conceded this impact, and so the debate's over. And so yeah, I would especially say there's very few teams who I find are especially good at impact calculus and resolving arguments. So I could see how some people could use it as a crutch to be like, I know we didn't do impact calculus, but we did tell you if they don't say fucking bourgeois, we win. So that is kind of how I see it, at least in terms of like not how it should be, but how it definitely is.
Yeah, I strongly agree with that. I think in like the current state of Parli, when framework matters on a ballot, it matters because there's a conceded frame out, right? And that's kind of just gets extended. And it's a way of getting around the substantive offense and the substantive impact comparison, which is really unfortunate, right? Because just from a judging perspective, it feels like shit to have to decide if you're going to vote on that or not. It's a terrible position to be in, but it also just, you know, kills clash completely. I think what framework should be doing in these debates to a certain degree is figuring out how this critique, which is usually going to operate on a very different level than the affirmative, and the affirmative can meet in the middle to do the comparison work, right? In an ideal world, I think both of those should be able to get weighed, and the frameworks where you're mediating what that weighing looks like because of how different the kind of levels that they're operating on are. And this is like back when I was like at policy camp in like 2013, sort of how I was taught to think about framework. So this is a pretty old school view, I think, but in my mind, at the end of the day, framework is not a win or lose issue. It's a mediation issue where the teams are figuring out how they're going to access their more substantive arguments and leverage them against them, which obviously isn't super strategic though, because then you don't get to go for those frame outs if you treat it that way.
And that's the problem, because right. I know this is why spreading exists. This is why people try and obfuscate in their positions. Right. This is why people read the same shit every round, whatever, right? If someone drops an argument, they win the debate. Like minefield debate is kind of the term I've been using because I stole it from Scott Phillips, who has a great blog. But the thing is, for me, like the number one thing I'm just looking for in debates is for kids to tell me how to resolve competing argument claims. Right. And you can do that by literally going online by letting doing it. Or you can give me like, you know, I would love just fucking once for a team that's like the AF to stand up, read a permutation, and then actually give me reasons why, like, you know what, like you should not be willing to vote on an incredibly small risk of a net benefit based on a relink, because like that's an a terrible standard. I want them to say things like the links to the K are not just to the plan tax, they're to the Speech Act, to the AC, to our representations, which means we should be able to because like perms are test of the link, not of the alt, and as a result, like we should be able to perm any shifts that come about in the back half of the debate because like their links aren't even about the app, so why does it matter if ours are about the alt? And like just any like textual comp versus functional comp, any of that shit I would love to see, but much like with framework, it's just like hope they drop it, and if they don't, we're moving on. Alex, you see him enthused.
Gabe and I are not fans of perms. Perms
Is this a perm video or is this
we can start out
Anything is everything.
I talked to these kids about perms a lot. Alex, you mentioned something a few minutes ago that I think ties into one of the things I want to talk about, which is the cap K versus other Ks.
Sorry, before we get into that, I just want to ask real quick. We're kind of touching on this idea of how the sort of design of debate as a game disincentivizes the kinds of discussions that we want to have on like this sort of impact comparison, right? Because it, kind of becomes this minefield situation, which is really interesting because that's exactly the way people outside of this digital room talk about the kinds of arguments that we're talking about, right? Like the people who don't really engage with the K kind of treat it as like, oh, it's just this thing and it doesn't mean anything, and it's just sort of like this gotcha argument that's meant to confuse and beat people because of like technical rules-based reasons, but not based on substantive clash. It's interesting because, I mean, maybe it's a little ironic that we're talking about this and being like, oh, if only we could have substantive clash, we could have this debate properly. But I guess, how would any of you frame that for someone like that, right? Like, so let's say there's somebody who isn't really like a fan of the K or doesn't understand it and sees all of it tied in with this sort of issue that you're all talking about, right? Which is whether it's the perm or the K or the framework or whatever, right? Like this thing that's kind of like there's this mechanical incentive to kind of do this blippy thing and succeed for technical reasons while circumventing the clash. Like, how would you explain the role of Marx or critiques in general as substantive clash that isn't just trying to avoid the topical clash, for lack of a better?
I will say, I think that the way you justify it is you justify it by justifying questioning the resolution or justifying questioning the assumptions of the resolution. So I think there's like this idea that the resolution itself is infallible, like especially among, stock issues debate, because stock issues debate places a lot of emphasis on the ability of the resolution to do something. But I think if we maybe this is shifting it a little bit too much, but take the extreme example of you take a resolution that has like very clearly messed up assumptions.
Sure.
Right. Like for instance, what's the best way, and this is not a real resolution, but like what's the best way to do concentrated animal feeding operations, right? Like that's a resolution that like asks good versus bad versions of CAFOs, but like very clearly there are a lot of messed up things around CAFOs, and like I don't think a lot of students would be like willing to just be like, oh, we can have that topical discussion without actually thinking about, wait a second, does the question itself have some sort of messed up assumption? And I think that like then it becomes a question of like there's enough literature out there, there's enough things that people have talked about that question every single part of every single resolution. And I think that might be a leap, but I think that introduction to that conversation is key.
I would also say that the K is kind of a product of like strategic incentives in debate, which is like, if you want to win, I think there are like, or the sort of K that you're talking about is like a product of strategic incentives in debate. And I think that the way that those strategic incentives shift things like topical debate is like similarly vacuous. I would say that it incentivizes things, if it's vacuous, it incentivizes things like reading like 15 diss ads instead of like one true one, or it incentivizes like process or actor counterplans that like don't really like engage with the core of the debate, which like, you can argue are or aren't educative. But I think that like whenever there are like those strategic incentives to change fundamentally what people are saying in debate, it's going to result in like people thinking that it's getting rid of the substance.
I
Do
was
you
gonna,
think it does?
It's a
I
different
think
substance.
I think if you're bad at debate, it does. I think if you're having good debates, I think you can still have it.
Well, and I think the other thing is like, at least from a Parli perspective, and I think that's kind of what Gabe's getting at, the lack of substance is just non-unique, right? Like, I love Parli. I think it's a really good format in a lot of ways, but most rounds, whether they're topical or critique based, are vacuous, in my opinion, and have over the last 5 years, like trended towards just increasing levels of being vacuous. And honestly, I just think the critique is actually one of the less egregious sort of offenders in that. I mean, like, I'm always going off about this, but I think theory is like, I love theory in a lot of ways, but what it does in Parli, right, is like the most ridiculous and vacuous thing. And also just the move towards like 4 or 5 off strategies without collapse often has kind of increased in Parli. All of those things are independent of the critique, right? That's just, I think, partially structurally because Parli, I think, has too few speeches. But, you know, I don't know. It sort of seems just like a broader problem with debate than with that type of debate, I guess.
Well, Ali, I guess what I'm getting at is like, how would you identify that difference, right? Like, how would you say like the model of debate that I want is different than like the theory stuff? Because I think the average like high school coach who's like just an English teacher or whatever, they don't really have a real distinction between like theory and case, right? So I guess like in the model that you like, I mean, I'm not asking you to develop a whole model or whatever, right? But like in a great type of round that includes a critique, what sort of discussion is being had and how is that different? Yeah, go ahead.
Right. Well, I mean, concretely, like I can point to a round, I think, which is what Paul was referencing, which is these two against DVC, right? Having a throwdown with cap on the AF and then cap good on the neg, right? And when I've seen most of the iterations of that round where teams know what they're doing, that's the clashiest thing I've ever seen in debate, I think, right? Like people just get to the heart of it. It's not topic clash, right? So if we're super like bound to the idea that clash has to be topical, then I concede like critiques are probably not super useful. But if clash more broadly is what's important, I think you can see that kind of throwdown happen really, really well. And I think some of the best rounds that I've seen in debate in terms of clash have been anti-blackness versus other critiques as well, where you get these highly differentiated ideas of like, can we have hope in political change? And you actually start to get warrants going back and forth based on historical movements. And when that happens, in my experience at least, I think you tend to get more educational, clashier rounds than you actually get with a lot of topical debate in Parli's current state. But again, you know, if you have an a priori assumption that clash should be bound by the topic, it's not going to give you that for sure. It's definitely something that is going to be unmoored from that, at least to a certain degree.
That blog I like had just a series of posts years ago that were just called like the Throwdown. And the head dude was just like, here's the position I'm willing to stake out about debate. I think this is true. Here's why I think it's true. Fill the comments up with why you disagree, and then I'm gonna respond to all of them. And like, and he just, and like, I read those this summer, and then the first thing I talked to my students about this year is I was like, all we're doing this year is throwing the fuck down. Yeah. That's it. Just like, I don't want us to be good at 800 things. I want us to have 4 things we're gonna do, and just do not care who you debate. Like, even if, you know, obviously we read Cap against y'all a lot, and not only are you like, in my opinion, the best team in the country, which, you know, NPTE seems to suggest that's true, but certainly I would say the best Cap team in the country. You've been reading for Cap for a long time. It's like an Oregon kind of legacy position and whatnot. And I don't know that you think of yourselves as like the best Cap debaters in the country or whatever, but like, yeah, well, Tyler's really good. But like, you know, you're the most fun Cap debaters, we'll say. And that's what really matters. And I remember watching that SEMS or finals round, whatever, I guess it was SEMS or Crossman. Yeah. And, you know, we read our thing. And when you were just like, it's just going to be like case or whatever, I was literally just clapping my hands like, yes, let's go. Like, no bullshit, like no theory, no whatever. I totally agree with all that stuff. And like, I guess I just to hopefully, well, not necessarily hopefully, people want to talk about it more, but like to put a little bit of a bow on like the theory versus K thing. Because I definitely used to be fairly anti-K, but it was mostly because I just didn't I felt most Ks that were being read against me were bad. Like, I didn't find it particularly difficult to be like, as a baseline assumption, this is wrong for these reasons, particularly on solvency or whatever, right? Marx being, I would say, and this is why I like it so much now, Marx being one of the only cases where I'm like, no, I get that. Like, you're actually saying someone should do something potentially, or like at least adopting a totalizing theory, which is something we'll talk about, I'm sure, at some point, like how that's unique to Marx, whatever. But what I wanted to ask was actually, when it comes to like this education discussion, whatever, do you think there is any difference between K debate, educationally at least, in what is ostensibly an extemporaneous debate format, like parliamentary, meaning you have limited amount of prep time and are given the topic changes every round, and like policy debate, and in particular when Parli is inherently not an evidentiary debate format? Because I guess when we get back to the incentives thing that Sasan's talking about, our incentives and disincentives, part of the not issue, because if you think K debate's fine, then whatever, that's totally cool. But part of the issue is that there's like this perverse incentive to have one position, you read every single round, AF or neg, or at least the vast majority of those rounds. You've practiced that collapse 800 million times in all these rounds. If it's framework, you're gonna have to worry about because you're reading on the AF, you've practiced answering that. And I would say the worst iteration of this, and like, look, I throw down, was just the last 5 years of different Berkeley Ks that used the same warrants in the framework. And feel free to jump off the ship at this point if you're not wrong, but like, I guess I would say actually in the last 2 years it's kind of changed. But there was literally from my senior year, I guess really junior year, until 2020, just like 5 different Ks that were read that used the exact same warrants, like the universe is infinite and predictions fail and reincarnation's real. So not only does that mean Buddhism, but also Nietzsche, but also, so on and so forth. And I guess like, I wonder how you feel about that when it comes to sort of the education debate, or at least like thinking about it from a game perspective. Like, surely we can agree that like the fairness issue comes into question when one team has infinite prep time and is just down on their shit, and then the other team, especially if they're the AF, kind of has an incentive to talk about the topic, because if not, there's a risk of topicalities. Do we have like thoughts on that?
I don't think there's a difference, because I think you have infinite prep time to prep framework. I think you should just get good at framework. Like, I think
What if you're the AF though?
Oh, okay. Well, that's different, because then what's like, you can practice the hedge dised, you can practice the econ dised for however many hours, infinite prep time, however much you want. I don't think that there is a functional difference between the type of education you get, like at the highest levels, right? This is we're not talking about the English teacher who thinks that the purpose of debate is to talk about housing policy, right? That's different. But I do think that like, when you get down to, is there a structural fairness differential between the critique and any other policy AF? Like, I don't think there is, because yes, while the critique is going to be a very specific, very static position between rounds as it's read, you're going to have to collapse to it differently. You're going to have to like engage with the debate properly. And that engagement is going to change round per round. And I don't know, why that's distinct from like the hedge dised.
I hear you, but there's a Proteus video where I flowed the NPTE and NPTE 2021 final round MGs, and the first 120 seconds is identical arguments being made on a set call K. Like, identical, word for word.
But that's a disadvantage for the team who's doing it, right? It's kind of everyone else's fault for not punishing them for that. That's kind of like, if we're throwing down, right, Berkeley did a lot of shit that I think is really annoying and ruined Parli, but also no one punished them for it.
That's totally true.
They could have punished them for it. And as long as no one's going to do that, it doesn't matter. If someone's reading the same critique every fucking round, you should have line by line answers for it, or at least like a solid impact turn for it. If you're going to read the changing topic every round, you do get, I think, a structural advantage in terms of, unpredictability. The other team has had 30 minutes to figure out that topic, and you're kind of actually, I think, advantaged by that if you might happen to have more knowledge about it. But I don't know why no one just read Tetlock. It's not that hard.
Well, someone did one time, and then the next round they just pretended all the authors were different but read the same works. But it wasn't a big deal. It didn't end my career or anything. So I hear you for sure.
So that all of that is, I think, a really I kind of don't come down with Paul on this, at least in theory, right? Because Paul's like, okay, well, what if you're the AF? Then in theory, the K debate is predicated on the strength of a link, right? And that link is predicated on what you read as the F. But that's
Can you win a no link in high level Parli on a K?
Well, not a no link, right? But that's kind of the thing, right? Like, I think the other sort of issues surrounding K's, but also more specifically like Marx, right, is I mean, I think Marx himself would say, like, what doesn't this fucking link into, right?
That's the term totalizing, right?
So then it comes down to what to me is my biggest, I guess, gripe with critical positions, which is this idea of solvency. And maybe I'm wrong about this, and this is what I want to discover and engage with. But my understanding, and again, let's imagine like a policy AF and a like critical neg, right? I think what the negative is attempting to argue is that the affirmative causes some sort of real world harm, right? That's what the impacts of the link are, right? That there's some sort of real world damage being done by the judge picking up the affirmative that is somehow resolved in the world by them picking up the negative instead, right? Which is what the roll of the ballot says, right? But I guess, like, how does that actually work? Like people will say, like, the roll of the ballot is like dismantling capitalism, but like one day, like, a history book's gonna say, like, well, the dismantling of capitalism really started in round 3 of novice Parli at the season opener. What is that story? That story's never like quite made sense to me, right? Like, I understand in a position where it's like, oh, okay, like, let's say a team does something really blatantly fucked up that we don't want in the debate space, but it's technically topical and they don't technically lose a substantive debate, where you're just kind of like, this is not a model that we should be pushing forward, and this space will be better as a result. What I kind of struggle to bridge is when the room is the size of the world, right? And you're talking about worldwide issues, how do we resolve for that through the roll of the ballot? How does it not become like a sort of like side discussion, like, yes, like, capitalism is bad, but that's non-unique to however the judge makes a decision there.
Well, I think one thing I will say is I think Marx doesn't play that, like, this round changes anything game. And this is what I see, like, the development of the Marx debate over the last, like, 5 years as being, right, is one, kind of almost fiating an alt, right? Like, I think most Marx Ks now are kind of fiating guerrilla war of some iteration, which we could question their ability to do that, but they get away with it to a large degree. And also, they're not really focused on, like, does the AF uniquely perpetuate like a capitalist harm? And part of that is this argument that, like we said, Tyler kind of introduced, right? Which is this collapse inevitable argument, where the question isn't, is capitalism good or bad? The question is, what does capitalism collapse into? And does the AF put its collapse into a different direction than the negative? And if you get to do this kind of fiat alt shit that Marx Ks are starting to do now, I think you get to sidestep the does this round matter discussion and actually kind of engage the AF on the fiat net Benz level that the affirmative sort of interacts on. I mean, Gabe and Alex, you can like weigh in on that because you were reading arguments like that, but that's sort of how I see them relating, at least.
Yeah, I think that fiating an alt is exactly what we would always just say, like, we're fiating the alt, like we're doing this method, you're doing that method, we're doing this method, we'll see how it goes. And I think that like it's good because it does get around this, like, you're just like two random people sitting in Alex's apartment saying like we're gonna do this sort of methodology, or like this sort of like, whatever alternative you want to do. And I think that it lets you weigh solvency in a way, or it lets you utilize solvency in a way that not only like gives you a lot of leverage against both like defense against the alt, but also like offensive takeouts, because you can use sort of historical empirical examples and make like arguments as you would a policy. But you also like avoid more vacuous like mischaracterizations of what you're trying to say. If you're saying like we're going to do guerrilla war and this is the book that we read to like figure out what that word meant, it's harder for people to be like, oh well, becoming a body without organs means you literally become a body without organs and you die, and that's an alt set. So I think that there's like a lot of offensive or strategic benefit to just fiating it.
Sasan, I assume Alex will want to talk on this too, but just like, because I don't think you ever really saw our kids too many times read like our version, and our version is heavily influenced by like a piece that Ali wrote, because we're doing like the dual power stuff. And again, do I read books? Not really, but I read these articles, so hopefully I didn't do it too wrong. But like the way we were explaining our alt, because we're talking about dual powers, we're like, look, like at like a concept thesis level of dual power as a strategy, the idea is to cultivate resources outside of the state so that we can create the material conditions for revolution to be successful. Because our thesis is like, if there was a revolution now, it would fail. A big part of why it would fail is because socialist organizations and organizing has not yet created institutions or apparatus or whatever it is, like just literal the things people need to survive, to get by. And people have an incentive to be faithful to the state because the state does provide those things, right? And so the way we were explaining like sort of perm preamp arguments is where like any perm just does not make sense on face when it includes the concept of dual power. Because if we are saying the like dual power is zero sum with the state, i.e. the entire point is to draw away from reliance on the state and to create resources that compete with the state, building up of state resources at the same time you build dual power is like not doing anything for you in the first place, because like again it's kind of zero sum. Like why would we do something that would convince people once again that like sure there's dual power resources now, but there's even more state resources. Beyond that, I would also say, and Al, you would probably know this way better than me, I just have this note written down from forever ago and I never even looked into it. I think it's McLaren who wrote stuff about Marx, but they're, as far as I'm aware, like one of the big authors on like anti-capitalist pedagogy as like a strategy that people were reading in policy a few years ago. I think that's kind of the other way people go with this song, where they're just like, the goal is to, a huge part of like the theory, especially of like Marxist-Leninists and Marxist-Leninist Maoists, is like the concept of like a vanguard party, and to have these like professional revolutionaries and people who know their theory and do the practice of it, but who a main thing they do is educate the proletariat on like socialism, Marxism, the strategies, the tactics, blah blah, like all of that kind of stuff, to sort of raise class consciousness and like build up people who can support that revolution. And I think part of the argument in those debates, at least, is like, if you're voting for us, what you're literally saying is that we have done a successful job of educating you on a Marxist platform, a Marxist tactic, a Marxist line, and that you are willing to endorse that as a potential strategy because you recognize the harms of capital, et cetera, et cetera.
I guess, well, I guess the answer that sort of made the most, that I kind of understood the best, was Ali's, and Ali's answer was basically like, we just kind of hand wave it, right? It was we're gonna have this fiat thing, because what I don't understand is like, how can you read the same cap K twice, right? Like it's either a unique situation to that round, right, where it's like, oh no, we're gonna resolve this problem in this round, or like you can't just do it later because it's going to be a lost cause after this round. Like how after that round is it not a lost cause or resolved, right?
Well,
because I think, please.
Well, I was gonna say, I just think like most captivators aren't thinking about the critique as something that impacts the real world necessarily. There is that approach that Paul's talking about where you can make that pedagogy approach. And I've heard people say like debate as a training ground for the vanguard or something like that.
Yeah.
But I think like where Captivate is in Parli to a certain degree is just to say, yeah, it might still be a lost cause after this round. How the fuck do you fiat the state? If you can fiat the state, why can't we fiat non-state actors as well as a part of our alternative, right? So it is hand wavy, but I think the debaters generally argue that fiat is just inherently hand wavy in that way. So why shouldn't the critique kind of get access to that at the same time?
If I can
Alex.
jump in,
Yeah, you got red potential, right, Alex?
the hardest we got clowned on guerrilla warfare was Ryan Rashid and Amanda Miskell saying you cannot fiat
Right.
revolutionary intent, right? That's the hardest we ever got clowned. So debating the boundaries of what fiat is in regards to the K is like, that's a debate that does and can occur.
Yeah, and should more.
I certainly think that, strangely, which I feel like with the K, you'd think this would be a huge part of every K. But like, strangely, what I find missing is like a lot of like actual just model of debate stuff. Just like arguments, like you think that's where framework would be really occurring, where it's like, this is what debate can be productive for or should be used for, or what is a desirable version of debate. But a lot of the time, again, since people are just doing spiky shit, they're not like making claims on that level. Like, Sasan, do you have any final thoughts? Like, it's like 20 minutes ago. I was gonna move on to the next Marx thing,
well,
but
whatever. Like, yeah, give me one more thing, because I
Do
think
it.
we're like
Hit it.
really zeroing in on something with fiat here, and I guess when I first started like coaching debate and feeling confident in like kind of my understanding of debate, like I never really did like the 4-year circuit or anything like that, but like I don't know, I've read a book, like I kind of like I have conversations, I kind of can figure out what people are talking about. Started to be like, some people like say certain things and give certain explanations, but I don't really understand it. So maybe they know something I don't. And my biggest hot take in debate, and this will transition back into fiat, is I don't think counterplans are real. Like I don't think it makes any sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't. So and I was talking to another coach about this, and they were like, "Well, the AF gets to read a plan. Why shouldn't the neg?" And it's like, the AF gets to read a plan because one team needs to read a plan for there to be a round. And it was like, well, why shouldn't that be the neg team? I was like, sure, let it be the neg team, and then let them go first, and then we'll just call them the AF. Like, so this idea of just like reciprocity just for the sake of reciprocity doesn't, I feel like, is how we talk about fiat sometimes. So my understanding of fiat is that fiat is essentially saying like for the sake of argument, right? Like it's like for the sake of argument, let's say the United States decides to send aid to Ukraine. Would that do good or would that do harm, right? And my understanding of like the power of fiat is kind of predicated on like it literally needs to enhance the argument that we're having. So instead of being like, well, such and such a senator would never vote for that, and like it's a Saturday, like Senate isn't in session, how are you going to do that, right? Like I think fiat is, my understanding of is like for the sake of argument, let's say it happened now, would it be beneficial or not, right? And I think the for the sake of argument thing like should be enhancing the clash. So I think when we come into questions of like alts for the K, right? Like, is there a way that we can justify the role of fiat for the enhancement of the round, right? Or the enhancement of the clash in some way similarly, or is it just kind of like the AF gets a hand wave, why doesn't the neg? And the AF gets a hand wave unreasonable things, right? That's not to say that every time the affirmative uses fiat, it's fair and good. But I mean, otherwise, like, why couldn't we fiat like Russia will stop its invasion, or like, you know, like object fiat, right? Like whatever like country we're talking about will surrender, right? Like that would, it's a hypothetical scenario where we're fiating an actor, but it kind of circumvents like the reality of the problem. So I guess what I want to get at is like, if that is the justification for affirmative, first of all, do you think that is how fiat works for the affirmative? And second, how does that interact with the idea that, well, the critique can be fiated because that's a function of how we have these discussions and debate?
Right on top, I will note that I know for a fact all three of the people here who are not the Proteus alum or whatever are like similarly in favor of like no condo's good. And I think that's because all three of them believe that the game of debate is about the AF's job, not so much the negative. And what I mean by that is all of them believe your fucking job is to prove the AF is the best possible option once you've staked it out. And the Neg's only job is to disprove that through any means they want. And so the burden of the negative is not to provide education. It's not to be fair. It is to provide reasons why the AF is not the most desirable or desirable compared to the status quo. But if someone else has more
real
detail.
quick, I mean, I definitely take that approach. The funny thing is, I actually think I agree that fiat on the Neg doesn't make a lot of sense. That's probably my most controversial opinion.
We're gonna get no Neg Fiat done after
I'm
this.
not
bro.
that
People
into
gonna cut the
it.
cards.
I think the Neg gets counterplans. I'm just not sure if they get to fiat them. Is kind of my perspective. I think they're opportunity costs. I think that's a distinction that's meaningful. But that's never going to be a battle we're going to win in Parli.
Can I just say that real quick?
There's only like 10 people,
quick,
Ali.
though?
We can get
Like,
7 of them.
if your counterplan isn't going to happen, though, how is that an opportunity cost? Right?
Right, and that's where the K is in trouble because it's non-unique, right?
Right. So with like, I don't know, like if I was like, Paul, you want to come over tomorrow? And he's like, well, if I come over tomorrow, I can't go to Disneyland. And he's like, and I'm like, are you gonna go to Disneyland tomorrow? He's like, no. Like, I think that's no longer a good reason, right? So the opportunity cost disadvantage model of counterplan, what I don't understand is if it's like, if the thing is gonna happen in the status quo, then it's just a DA. And if it's not gonna happen, then how is it an opportunity cost?
And I mean, I think the answer is just that, like, no one thinks about counterplans that way except for a couple of us. That's what counterplans are, right? Like, Parli's not into that view of counterplans, unfortunately. But like the other thing too, real quick, because I do want to answer the question of like, does fiat on the alt enable a better debate? Because I do think that's like the important fucking question here. And I think that is like the smart reason the AF gets fiat, right? Is who wants to hear a debate about would? We want to hear a debate about should. We're asking normative questions, not probabilistic questions. And those are what we want to debate. And I actually do think giving the alt fiat, like aside from my theoretical, I don't think the Neg should actually get fiat bullshit. I do think giving the alt fiat gives you a better debate. Because instead of having like a kind of fundamentally non-falsifiable debate about whether or not this speech act can affect this room, we get to have a throwdown about whether or not historical movements for Marxism or historical guerrilla wars worked, why they didn't work, why they lost, and the actual like, yeah, okay, you get your method, like you can have a revolutionary movement. Let's talk about the history of revolutions and the problems that happened there. And I actually do think we get clashier alternative debate when we do kind of enable the should instead of the would debate there. So I think that's defensible. Like, if we're going to play this game with negative advocacies, I do think we get better clashy advocacies if we do that.
So now, for the love of God, an hour and 10 minutes in, let's get to our second question about the Cap K.
Oh my God.
Cap K versus other Ks, right? And obviously there's a million Ks out there, but it's, I would say, I think it's safe to say, one of the other dominant strategies are things pertaining to like identity politics, if that's the terminology you want to use in terms of things like anti-blackness, perhaps, or other things. And part of this, obviously, I just want to talk about that in general. Your thoughts on that, how that should be playing out, maybe where people are making the wrong strat calls when it comes to cap versus that, or maybe even the opposite. Like, how should you address it? But the other thing I kind of want to talk about here was like what I see as a distinction between like criticisms with like what I would call strong links and criticisms with what I would call weak links. And what I mean by that is like, especially with Marx, because again, totalizing theory. Like a strong link for me on Marx, which is what you see, I guess, in most policy debates, is like, look, all people are one way. It's this way. This thing describes the world, and you ain't that. So like, you're bad, right? Like, That's it. This applies to everyone and everything in every way, right? Which is like a pretty intense claim. And then when you have to read an alt to solve that, requires a pretty intense solve. Versus what I think, especially against other Ks, is much stronger is like a weak link, which is instead of anything really totalizing, you just say stuff like identity politics fractures resistance movements. And then you're like not making a claim that like the only thing that matters is cap, or even the most important thing is cap, but instead you're making an argument about how like what are the political ramifications of a bunch of different groups pursuing competing claims about identity, etc., etc. So like I guess cap K versus other Ks in general, whether that's AF, Neg, and then potentially any thoughts you have on that, especially in like the identity politics debate, because it seems to come up a lot now. It seems to be, I would say, even the cap K in a lot of respects has become the dominant strategy, at least K strategy, against identity politics types AFs if you're not going to read framework.
I'm confused what the question is.
My question is, what are your thoughts on how are people approaching cap K versus other Ks? Like, how is the cap versus other K debate being played out? Are people doing it right? What do you like? What don't you like? What would your approach be, et cetera, et cetera?
I think the correct, and this is largely happening, I think the correct strategic utility of the cap K is that it gets you access to the materialism debate, and we have a materialist explanation of your impacts. And I think that's like, in my opinion, the reason, or the debatey reason why Marx is like incredibly well suited. And I think that's like maybe not the best, but some of the best education that comes out of those, because it's a debate about like, how do impacts operate? It like, even absent the question of how you're able to resolve those impacts, is how do impacts operate? Do they operate in this kind of metaphysical domain, or do they operate on the literal material domain? And those are the kinds of questions that I think are useful to parse out. And I think that's like the type of clash that I think the Marx versus other K, like identity K.
Could you say a little bit more about the sort of material versus metaphysical like framing of the impacts?
Yeah, so I guess let me ground this in the anti-blackness versus Marx debate, because I think this is the one we thought about towards the end of the year the most. The argument from anti-blackness is oftentimes that blackness is ontological, which means that it precedes the kind of materialist understanding, because the construction of civil society is, and the capitalism, the capitalist system that like comes as a result of that construction, is preceded by the creation of blackness as ontological. The question then becomes, are the impacts that are conferred upon the black body born out of that ontological question, or are they born out of the material conditions that capitalism imposes? So I think that like that clash is a very interesting point of clash, and I think that's like probably the most interesting, to me at least, point of clash in terms of that debate.
Yeah, I mean, I will say, oh, go ahead, Gabe.
Yeah, so I think I mostly agree with Alex, but I think that probably the best argument or reason the Marx K clashes is because it's kind of a question of like methodologies that you take in response to resolving impacts. It's not just like the methodologies you take in like the alternative, but also like the methods you use in your analysis as well. And I think that it's like a very deep literature base on like specifying what is causing things to happen or change. It presents a totalizing worldview of like what the superstructure is in general, and then also has like room to criticize only operating within the superstructure to a point that it allows you to make, I mean, semi-generic, but like relatively like pointed critiques of most methodologies that don't literally change things. And I think that's where a lot of the game comes from.
Yeah, I mean, I think when me and Sean were first getting into it, right? So we had that old Tom Shalley shell that I don't even know if people know that was Tom Shalley's shell originally, but that's where that comes from. And when we had that, the thought process was what Alex said, I think, right? It's to get that materialism argument. And if you look at like the old Oregon Dropbox files, there's one like long Marx file where the answers to other critiques are just explanations of like where the fuck their impacts come from, right? It's not even like really links in the proper sense, but it is this sort of alternative explanation. And I think that is where the Marx K is super helpful, because you don't have to contest like a lot of the K that you're answering. You can concede that anti-blackness is real, and maybe even that it operates in some of the ways that the other critique says, but you're contesting why it operates that way and where it emerges from. And then I think that bleeds into what Gabe's getting at, which is, so what's the starting point to get at fixing it, right? And that's where the method part, in addition to the explanation part, comes in. And a good Marx debate, I think, should be doing those two things, right? We're doing an explanatory theory that circumvents theirs to explain their K, and then we're saying, as a result of that explanation, there's a different method that's needed here. And that's where we can really start to do more, I think, kind of like link differential work in response to identity politics, or in response to more nihilistic politics that obviously trade off with the kind of methods that Marxism is interested in.
What's really interesting about all of that framing is that, you know, I was a philosophy major and I'd read a little bit of whatever, and then you're starting to hear these Ks and get into it. And what's interesting is that so many Ks, the more you know about the author, the less it has anything to do with the K. Like Nietzsche, for instance. Like, I remember, like, when I was first, like, starting debate, there was this, like, Nietzsche roll the dice K, and I was just like, Nietzsche didn't say anything like that. I one time pulled up a file I found somewhere of, like, the entire corpus of Nietzsche. Like, every word he ever wrote, and just control F'd, like, dice. And, like, just, like, didn't come up. Like, dude just never said that. I think like one person talking about Nietzsche said that. But what's interesting to me is that the philosophy of Marx, the philosophy itself is strategically what the K does in debate, right? Like, when we're talking about, like, well, you want your K to be the, like, root cause of what your opponent is talking about, like, that is what Marx argues about, you know, capitalism and all of that. So it's really interesting that, like, sounds kind of like strategically and functionally that the Marx K just is a better K, because the rhetoric of a critique itself is rooted in the rhetoric of, you know, Marx's critiques of capitalism or whatever itself.
We were talking about this the other day, but like, the reason Marx is such a good K in all debate, but especially in Parli, is because it just is a totalizing theory, and most other Ks are not meant to be totalizing theory. They're about like a specific set of conditions in a time and a place, or a certain like subject matter. But Marx is just like, no, this is the history of the world is predicated on this. And like, and one thing I just love about like Marx, good Marx debate, Marxist writing, all that stuff, is that in comparison to every other K, Marxists just take their history so fucking seriously. Like, it's like every other K, you're like, who did this? And they're like, the Zapatistas kind of were like nomads, and you know, that's a thing or whatever. And it's like, but if you ask like good Marxist debaters, or like people who've done the like reading or whatever, like what's an example of this? They're just like 150 years deep on this shit of like every time anyone's tried anything, how those were good, how the failures show us where to go next, like, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and like how it's reflective of the theory as opposed to just like people randomly doing stuff in that sense. I think that that's like really, really important for a debate context, because like it's, you don't have to like, there's this concept of like spin, right, where like, and it's more of a policy debate thing where it's like the evidence actually says this, but I'm gonna make it say this. So the card just says like presidents use political capital to like change the world, but I'm gonna make that be Obama will use political capital to change the world. It's like Obama's not in that card, but he is a president, so like I'm spinning it. And with every other K, you have to do a lot of spin, because like they were not talking about whether we should grant endangered status to gray wolves in the northern Rocky Mountains when they wrote like 1,000 Plateaus. But like, again, Marxist authors are like, no, it's actually about the world. It's about now, it's about back then, and so on and so forth. So like, it just, to me at least, seems so much more applicable. And I would say, at a minimum, there's been a lot of times, like whether it's when I was competing or when I was coaching, which is now, and I'm trying to get an answer about AK that we're reading, we're writing, or someone else is reading or writing, and I can't find someone talking about anything like that, because again, that's not what they did, or like what the discussion's even about, and when for the people who are about that philosophy. But if you try and look up like Marxist Leninist perspective on fucking anything, you will find someone who's just like throwing down on that, and then like 800 people who disagree with them, and like you're a fucking bootlicker, you're not even, you're a shit line or whatever. And so I just think that that's cool, and I think a big part of that comes from the idea of it being like scientific socialism, right? That like it's iterative and about learning from, the past, the present, etc., etc. I don't know if anyone has.
Paul mentioned this idea that Marxist rhetoric frames the failures as something to learn from, and I think it slips my mind right now, but Ali said something that was, we're talking about just all of this totalizing theory, and you were talking about how Marxist sort of ideology clashes, at least in debate, with sort of like the whole nihilism thing, and I guess that's something that I wonder in debate, but also just in life, right? Like I think a very sort of hand-wavy dismissal of Marxism is this idea that it's very lofty and like optimistic. But I think it's a long-standing and not completely without merit idea, right? Like Marx talks about like the end of history, right? Where everything is as good as it needs to be and changes just don't need to happen, right? And I know like Nietzsche criticizes that idea as just being sort of like a comforting lie that people tell themselves, right? And just generally, like for me personally, I have a really hard time feeling optimistic about any political stance, right? Because what feels crazy to me is when there's a political discussion, it's not like, is there any possible way of solving all of the world's problems? It's just like, well, is it this option, or is it that one of them is going to solve all of the world's problems, but it's just we just happen to disagree on which of these two things it is, right? And I guess what I want to know is, personally and functionally in debate, I guess two separate questions. Like, how do you reconcile that sense of like maybe naive, maybe realistic optimism that seems to me to be grounded in Marxism?
Yeah, I mean, to give an answer for debate, at least, I think the big thing, and Paul, I think you kind of hinted at this, that's happened in debate, is people have stopped talking about Marxism, right, and talking about iterations of Marxism. And I think the introduction of Maoism as like one of the predominant things about Marxism that we talk about in debate is a big part of that, right? Because if we think about like contemporary Maoist philosophy, a lot of it is focused on thinking about how socialism has gone wrong as a project and how communism as a project has lost a lot of revolutions. I mean, from the Maoist perspective, there essentially aren't existing communist states today, right? Like it is kind of defeatist in that regard to a certain degree. But at the same time, part of what Maoism introduces to the discussion is this idea that failures are learning opportunities, right? And that every time that we have this failure, we learn something more from it. And when you push kind of Maoist philosophy on this, this is why it says that it's necessary, right? You know, Marxism-Leninism, according to the Maoist, was like the science of its time, and then it failed. So now we need to reflect on that and be concrete about it. And so Maoism, of like all the iterations of Marxism, I think does the most to kind of like take the limits of Marxism historically seriously and try to think about how those limits might not undermine the ultimate, kind of idea behind it. And I think that has done a lot for debate, for people to get to say like, yeah, Marxism is this lofty thing that is trying to get at this thing. And also over the last 100 years, like it's fucked up in a lot of ways, and we haven't achieved that. And there might be reason to kind of feel nihilistic about it. But also then Maoism gives us the ability to reframe that and say our Marxism can be better, can be iterative, can be more scientific, because we went through those setbacks. And that lofty goal isn't something that we just will into being, right? We learn along the way and then we struggle to get there. So that's kind of how I see that playing out. And I think that really is part of Mao coming into debate as a kind of theory and literature base on its own.
Yeah. Oh, Alex, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was also going to say, I don't know. I feel like there's not, at least in terms of the debate space, a value, or like, going for the alternative or going for guerrilla warfare or some revolutionary line, like the downsides to that and the kind of political nihilism that can occur and like real discourse and like among leftist circles outside of debate, that exists in debate, and that's what you talk about. That is the debate. So right. I think that like, having those discussions is probably the way that the debates play out in themselves. And then also, the political project of Marxism and that kind of thing, and the defeatist attitude that comes out a lot. I don't know, it just seems like try or die. Might as well try.
I'm sorry to cut in there. That's the thing. It's like, I feel like when it comes to like the alt stuff for any CapK, it's like, yeah, we get it. The alt fails like 90% of the time probably, but 100% of the time, the collapse of capitalism is worse. So right. Fuck it, bro. Like try or die.
Honestly, I think then the issue is that most AFs just don't seem fun enough. Right? Like, because the whole try or die thing is like, well, if it's gonna, who cares if there's like a 1% chance, But like the reason why in the real world people don't want to try difficult political projects is because they have like other fun stuff they're doing, and it's like, it's hollow and like not well substantiated. But I think maybe the answer is just AFs that seem just more pleasant to do.
I mean, the Oregon GL blocks are kind of, in that direction when it comes to cap. They're just like, okay, number one, first off, you're gonna fucking fail, and you're gonna fail real bad, and here's 80 reasons why.
Right.
And also, talking about hedge is way cooler than this, so why the fuck are we, blah blah blah.
Well,
blah.
no, but in all seriousness, I think, Alex, that answer that does kind of get at the core of kind of what I'm saying, because I think, the Maoist analysis is really good and really interesting, but I think it can get painted as like, okay, that thing that failed isn't technically us, right?
Sure.
So, but it's not so much like, but here's the reasons why we might not fail. And I think you make a really good point, Alex, but I'm sure all of you would agree that, okay, yeah, I guess the framing is sort of like a try or die, like, I guess, what else are you doing? Which is just like, I guess the AF isn't like, I don't know, Elden Ring just came out. Have some Cheetos, I guess I could do that. Like the real reason people don't do things in the world.
I do hate the like, I call it the Josh Alpert hashtag thing, because he used to do this a lot. I used to go, that's hashtag not our Buddhism. And like, I do hate that tendency in debate to be like, oh, well, that's not us. And then to not kind of do what Sasan talked about, which is like, okay, but like, assuming that's not you, why do you overcome that problem?
Here's the thing, though, that I will say for that. Maoism doesn't do the that's not us, though, right? This is what I think you have to give it credit for, is the Maoists will be like, yeah, we are also Stalin and we are also Lenin, and Stalin and Lenin were wrong about things, right? Because it has that iterative approach. If you're doing it right, you're not hand-waving the past shit. You're actually owning up to it, right? And you're actually kind of saying you have a responsibility to learn from it. But it can definitely sound like the no true Scotsman thing if it's being done flippantly.
Sure, but you did mention specifically how like the framing of failures as you did mention that.
Okay, here's just
Paul,
a straight up.
It's kind of dark in that room, bro.
The lights are on. The lights are on in this room.
Where?
Bro, hold on.
Got a ring light.
Oh my god!
Like it's not a good light. I apologize. Here's what I want to ask. Okay, just straight up, super debatey, stepping away from like, I guess, well, I mean, it's still theory, but whatever. Like, what is your best cap debate argument? Like, what argument, whether it's from one of your shells, just stuff do you think is like, if this isn't in your cap K, I think you're doing it wrong. To give an example, and again, probably the least experienced Marx debater, especially when I was a competitor, but like as a coach, even person of the people here who've done Marx stuff, we lived and died by our monopoly capitalism argument. And I remember, I think it was Gabe actually in like our group chat, like messaging us like after one of the rounds you had against my kids. And you're just like, did you write that monopoly capitalism argument? And I'm like, I did write that monopoly. He's like, fucking, it's a good argument. I was like, okay, cool. And that was just stolen straight from a Red Menace podcast. I can't remember if it was like episode 2 or episode 3. It might have been, how am I so dumb? What is to be done?
It would have been imperialism, the highest stage.
Imperialism, yes, yeah. Thank you. The highest, yeah. And I remember reading this and like reading. I remember transcribing your podcast, and I heard that, and I was like, that is the best argument I have ever heard on a Cap K, and I've never seen anyone even really go for it. And like we were just framing it all year, and Sasan, I don't know. Again, you might not. These people have had to deal with this argument potentially, and Ali, I stole it from. So, but the idea is basically just like capitalism has an inherent tendency towards imperialism and monopoly capitalism because capitalists have a vested interest in controlling the resources, controlling capital, etc., getting more workers, and so they form monopolies. You know what I mean? Whether that's with the state or with other competitors or with whatever, right? And the utility of the argument is that the A strat for most teams answering cap is cap good. They're like, and usually it's the same kind of like, cap's really good because of vaccines, or cap's really good because of, you know, fucking carbon capture technology that doesn't work or whatever, right? Like cap's good because it's made some things that help some people at some point. And the monopoly capitalism argument is that because capitalism inevitably trends towards monopolies, all of those things you're talking about in terms of innovation, competition, etc., don't actually materialize in a meaningful way. And in fact, it's the exact opposite. There's an incentive to pave out competition, to not innovate, but instead to just combine so you don't have to compete with each other anymore. And I think that if you looked at history and you look at corporations and mergers and stuff, you definitely see that's real. And so against everyone but Oregon, that was just money for us all year because it got dropped all the time. And then like the start of the MG or the MO was just like, whoops, you lose the debate, you drop monopoly capitalism, frames out all of your offense on like the cap K, any risk of alternative solvency, vote for us. So thanks, Ali. And no thanks to you other two, but like something like that. Like, I don't know if you have a specific argument you think about in your shell where you're like, even if you didn't win a lot of debates on it, or even if people didn't think it was that great, like what is the argument from the shells you've read or from your just readings, whatever, where you're like, people should say this like all the time and it's just money.
I'll go real quick because my wife is annoyed that I've been talking about debate for this long, so I'm probably gonna have to dip out.
For sure. And thanks so much for being here.
No, it's been fantastic. But honestly, it's not for my shell, right? I think like really, and I keep saying this, UT Tyler introduced this inevitability argument about collapse. I think they're the first team that really like doubled down on it. That's the argument that wins fucking cap debates, right? Because if collapse is inevitable, it doesn't matter if cap is good, right? You get to sidestep the cap good discussion in an ideal world where you win those inevitability claims. And also, this relates to the conversation we've all been having in Discord. What's super fucking cool about that argument is it's a defensive argument, so teams drop it, right? Because it is a defensive uniqueness framing claim, and people just fucking underestimate it. And then you leverage that all over every single other sheet of the cap debate, especially on the impact turn level of the debate, and it's over, right? I think that is really like, if there's one argument that has made Marx what it is in debate as kind of a go-to answer to a lot of things, that argument getting introduced by Tyler really, I think, is what does it.
So if I could follow on really quick, because I know you got to go.
Yeah.
What do you think is the best warrant or the best explanation for why collapse of capitalism is inevitable, whether that's like grounded or just theoretical or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, so grounded climate change, right? I think like this is the contradiction it can't overcome. There's some interesting arguments there, but also theoretical though. Like, if everyone wants like a book where you can go get this, Clara Zetkin's writing on fascism, I think is really good, where Zetkin makes the argument that fascism is what capitalism does in moments of crises, right? That's what it descends into. There's a whole bunch of interesting stuff about the contradiction between the bourgeoisie and the petty bourgeoisie that she does there. But those kind of more theoretical arguments arguments work well with the Marx kind of theoretical claim that capitalism is inherently prone to crisis, right? And so if you have those two things combined, this argument that capitalism is always trending towards fascism in the status quo, I think ends up playing out really well. And then you can use the climate change as and now especially it's trending towards fascism because here's this crisis, which is of a scale we haven't seen before.
Sure.
Ali, and this is also a question for Alex and Gabe, but you got to go soon. So this is a question that I just try to ask everybody who we get to interview on the channel. It's two questions. One of them you kind of already answered, so let me just know real quick, would your answer to this question be different than something you've already talked about? What is something that everyone in debate is wrong about except for you?
I mean, probably the counterplan thing, other than you, actually. I truly
Thank
don't
you.
think
Oh
that
my
makes sense on the neg. Like, I really don't think it does, but that's just never going to change.
I think just like good taste in music, good taste. Okay, the second thing is honestly, like, who is somebody that has helped you in debate? Or just, yeah, in the debate world, get to where you are, but has no idea.
Has no idea.
Just doesn't know. You've never gotten a chance to let them know.
Think about that. There's so many people who I think I could pick. I mean, so it's kind of a cop-out because she's one of my best friends, but Amanda Ozaki-Lahan, I don't think probably thinks of herself as having had a huge influence on me, but when I was coming out of the four-year circuit, watching her and Richard Ewell just like fucking crush everybody on that Bartleby the Scrivenger thing that they were going for. There's a whole bunch of other like interesting critiques, was super inspiring to me, and it actually got my ass kicked by her and Richard at some points too. And I think, you know, really loved how they were debating and stood out to me as people who I wanted to emulate their style. So many of my LOs, especially, I was just like trying to channel what Richard Ewell was doing. So that partnership in particular from Concordia, I think had a huge impact on me as a debater. And I don't know if they necessarily know because they didn't coach me or anything like that. So those are probably the two people, Richard and Amanda, who I was always trying to emulate when I was like actually competing, I think.
Yeah, thanks so much, I, for
awesome.
everything, being here and whatnot. And if you gotta go, you gotta go.
Yep. Have fun, guys.
Yeah,
Oregon
great
boys,
talking to you.
Are we feeling like we're close to the end here? Because if so, we can ask you that same question. We can call it a day, or
Yeah.
See,
I don't have plans. I never have plans.
either.
Awesome.
Yeah, right on. We're hanging out.
Monday night.
We're
Okay.
rolling, dude. Okay. Hey, here's the thing. That Marx shit. Okay, that's cool. I think we
Wait,
all
wait.
like Marx. But go ahead.
Can I say one thing that nobody ever challenged us on was the argument that Ali was talking about, the capitalist collapse is inevitable. We used to read two warrants.
Yeah, they're bad. They're bad.
They're terrible. They're both warrants for the economy will collapse, not capitalism will collapse. The first warrant we read was quantum computing means that stocks can get traded faster than light, which, first off, there are companies that are literally trying to fix that by adding fiber cables. Nobody ever answered that warrant. And then second was doom loops, which is just a scenario for economic collapse. I think like maybe we had two rounds where people like would go for or like answer the warrants, and then Gabe would just read like climate change and disease also collapse capitalism.
I mean, I think the best argument is like the theoretical stuff Ali was talking about. And usually if we ever got pressed on those arguments, I would just shift to that because I honestly can't explain what doom loops are right now. I never really extended the argument. But yeah, we just never got pressed on it. And it's like the whole debate.
I was I don't remember what was going on in the world the other week, but I just started looking into like, all right, man.
I'm gonna be right back real quick.
Yeah. I was like, all right, man, full on nuclear war, right? Every human dies. What is the most damage humanity can do to the planet? Like, that's what I was trying to figure out, right? It turns out it will be fine, right? Like, worst we can do is we'd kill out humans, but plants and whatever, some animals would live. A little while later, it'll be fine. And like the best that we can do to the planet, like, seems like a lot of problems will still happen, right? Like a meteor will inevitably strike, some volcano will erupt. Like, not a lot that we have the power to do to like save us from, and not a lot of damage that we can do. So it's just kind of like, all right, we'll just fucking make the best of it, right? But what you're talking about with like the economic collapse stuff is, again, like I think there's certain ideas in terms of like impact framing that we take for granted, like econ collapse, bad, right? Not that it's not good or whatever, but that is this sort of like extinction level impact. But like, why? Like the economy's collapsed before, right? So is it going to be worse than that, or is it going to be
How dark did it get in
different?
this room while I was gone?
It's pretty bad.
Dude, that's ridiculous.
Let me just find a white screen or something.
Yeah, that's really funny. But I guess that's a really interesting point that you're pointing out, that like econ collapse, like how is that even necessarily showing that capitalism collapses or really any other institution collapses? Because like economies have collapsed many times in the last 600 years, and it seems like capitalism's only gotten stronger each time. So do you feel like there's, I mean, what do you think accounts for that? What do you think accounts for debaters sort of just like taking certain arguments for like, oh, well, this is just a truism, and don't really consider the actual implications or the actual like warrant?
I think for the like Marx implication of like that argument that economies have collapsed, it's that like the argument is that like capitalism will collapse and it'll result in fascism. And I think that the like continuation of that is that like every time the economy collapses, that results in like this stronger capitalism that is like shifting more towards fascism, right? Like a broader social collapse results in more authoritarian policies against like minorities, or different like recessions result in like different mandates that like, you know, stop movement on the border or something like that, or different like iterations of us seeing like populations become more disposable due to things that happen in the economy and the structure of society. But I think that your bigger point about like people just saying like this causes this to happen, that's bad. Like, I mean, it's pretty easy to like call debate a race to like a nuclear scenario, and then like, you know, probably like 30% of rounds I'd forget to say that nuclear war causes extinction because everybody just assumes it does in debate. But like, I mean, does it? I think that's like honestly a debate we can have. I think like there's a lot of, you know, food left on the table when it comes to like impact defense in itself in Parli, just because people don't really like question why, if in reality, like we're always like one missed policy away from Putin pressing the button, why is the world the way it is? And it's because like debate exists in like this weird like strategic game where it's strategic for everyone to always race to extinction, and like people don't always think about like the implications of the arguments.
I wonder.
I was gonna say, I think when it comes to cap in particular, it's very dependent upon the story, though, right? Because sometimes the story, like in terms of the collapse, is like, this is much more of like a policy debate thing, but they're like, this specific resource is the bedrock of a capitalist economy, and it's running out, and once it does, that's it, like cobalt or whatever, right? Because of batteries. And then other times it's like, we have already deployed every mechanism for coming back from recessions, right? Like after the last recession, we kind of emptied the tanks. We did the last thing we could with like Federal Reserve interest rates or with whatever stimmy checks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And like we've now reached a point where like the number on inflation, were we to do it again, would just collapse, blah, 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 et cetera. And then like kind of change the incentives in that way, Sasan. And so I think that's another kind of element to it too, where it's like it really depends on like what your story of the collapse of capitalism is for how you're going to do that. And then before I finish that, I also just got like a 10-minute warning from my wife, so I got like 10 minutes, so we could finish this thought and then ask those questions. And I appreciate
I guess like sure, that's a specific point for that specific reason, but Gabe, more to your broader point, I guess that kind of invites the question for me of like, why aren't people better at debate? Like, why isn't it more competitive? Why is it that you're here being like, I don't understand why nobody ever made this argument against us, right?
And national champions.
Right, that's what I mean, right? Like, why is it like, and I think there's certain like institute, like there's people have a limited amount of time that they can debate. There's some checkbacks against that, right? Like you get to get coached by Allie, and she brings in a lot of experience, but there's also like how many really involved, really talented coaches are there doing Parli who are, under the age of 35? Like,
I think it's because the drive to win might not, and here's, I think Gabe's laughing because anyway, I think that like the end game is being a national champion, and I don't think everybody cares about that. Like I know I do, I know Gabe does, and I know Paul cares, right?
Yeah.
And, Sasan, I assume you're in the activity, you care.
Well, no, I agree that like as a model of how you approach, like, yeah, I think you have to care about your I don't know if I'm lagging here or anything. It feels like I am. But yeah, you have to care about winning, or else what else are you doing?
I think a vast majority, maybe not a vast majority, but a majority like don't want it as much as like the top, 1%, the top 4 teams in the country.
How many teams do you think each year are actually like on the level elite
In Parli?
in Parli?
5.
I think
Yeah.
5's max, right?
Yeah.
Every year.
Yeah,
And-
I think
and-
there's usually like 3 that are like at the top of every tournament every year, and then when nationals comes around, there's like
Dark horse or
2
two.
outsiders.
Well, do you think that number is how many people are like that level of elite, or do you think that's like how many people are like putting in the real effort, or do you think there's even a difference between that? Like, do you think the people who genuinely care and put in that effort eventually reach that elite level?
I think that's the case. Like I don't there might be a situation where people do care enough and do put in the work and don't get there. I don't know if that's the case right now. And I don't like,
I think
don't
that's
know.
the case pretty often. I
Okay,
mean,
well,
like Paul, like, I don't know. When I met Steve for the first time, he was like, yeah, we got this debater, flowing rounds over the summer. And he was talking about Paul, and like, Paul didn't get there. So.
That's fair.
Right,
Okay.
but-
I was talking about like,
Well, I don't mean necessarily like winning the title, right? But I mean like, well, to Paul's credit, right? Paul tells the story a lot of, that Berkeley had this K and he hated the K and he lost to the K, and then he spent a year writing the answer to that K, and then the quarterfinal round of the NPTE. Oh, that's the problem. My laptop's not plugged in. Give me 1 second.
I'm sorry,
Quarterfinal
Paul.
round of the NPTE, we debated Tom and Tom.
There we go. Okay, yeah, sorry, my laptop got unplugged. That was my issue. So he finally gets to read this answer and is like, here is why your case sucks and I hate you personally. And finally he got to win that round, right? Like, there's so much of that you can't control ultimately, like the result you get, right? But in terms of like doing good enough work to get there, I mean, I'd say Paul was there, right? I think he was in the conversation. But the question is, like, if we're talking about a really highly competitive, really successful team coming out here saying, like, I don't know why nobody ever tried doing this stuff against us, like, how much of that is because there's not enough teams, like, trying that hard? And what do you think accounts for that?
I mean, I agree a little bit with Alex, but I think the bigger thing is that like debate's really hard. Like it's like when you do it for a while, like we did it for 8 years, it like you can forget easily that it's like you're standing up and you're talking as fast as you can, and you're trying to remember the best thing you had to say about every single thing they said. And like I don't think there's a single speech I ever, maybe some LORs, but a single MG I ever gave where I like sat down and I was like, that was like perfect. That was optimal. There's always like arguments that like I could have said better, said faster, explained better. It's like every speech is like that because the event's really hard. So it's like you know, at the end of the day, we're just saying like people didn't answer this, like the fact that our two warrants on like this one argument that we usually blew up, like people didn't really answer it super specifically. Like we're talking about like something that it takes Alex 15 seconds to read at max. And I think that's the bigger thing, is that like it's difficult, and like
at the highest level they're just one on the margins. Like it's just the most marginal difference between really good teams, right?
Well, and I know we're low on time, Paul, but I another question that brings to mind is, do you think debate benefits from or is hurt by the fact that you're out here debating, but Ali isn't and Paul isn't, right? Like eventually in any competitive activity, you get to the point where you're like, you know, you just sort of age out of it, right? Like you'd like basketball, whatever. You just can't keep up with the young players. You have the experience and the talent and whatever, but it's all catching up with you. And debate is a very artificial time limit where it's like, oh, you got your bachelor's or whatever, so you're done. Do you think debate as an activity benefits from that turnover rate of like, no, let's bring in fresh people, fresh ideas, fresh strategies all the time? Or do you think it kind of makes the competitive depth of the activity shallower than you think it should be, because the alleys of the world are now just coaching instead of actual competitors?
I will say I think that's actually the biggest and hardest thing, and I think this is in part what produces the most like disparate results amongst people, because I think I've talked to the Oregon boys about this, but like obviously, you know, they just talk about they debated for 8 years, and that means they debated in high school and they debated in college, and like, you know, whether they had like a great coach or not, they at least had some people on their team who went on to be very good debaters in their own right, and et cetera, right? The reality for me is I had 5 semesters where I was at a school that had like coaching beyond like you and me hanging out at your house listening to death grips and like just trying to figure shit out on our own, right?
Yeah.
And like it felt, I mean, I was working just like constantly, and you know, and still never won, but like, I mean, all I did was work on debate all the time, like it was a full-time job. And I only had those like 2 years to really do that, you know, so it felt like impossible at that time. And now as a community college coach, it feels kind of impossible, with a minor exception, again, because it's like, dude, I get 2 years, and the people I get are not people who've done debate in high school, and quite frequently they're students who like otherwise wouldn't have had an opportunity to go, kind of like myself, who wouldn't have had an opportunity to get an education or go to college. And so like sometimes it's just like, oh, this kid just doesn't understand like college level writing or like college level understanding of arguments at all, and they have to go debate against this person who's already been debating for 6 years. Like when I met Gabe and Alex, I remember we had this conversation like pretty early. I was like, you've been debating as long as I have, and I'm a senior, like, or I'm not even a senior, I was already a grad student when I met you two, and you had already been debating as long as I was in the activity, and that's counting my like 2.5 years at DVC or whatever, where it was just CC stuff. And I just find that I think more and more what we're seeing actually is, and this has kind of always been true to a certain degree, but like if you look at the people who are in NPTE finals and NPTE finals, it's almost exclusively people who did debate in high school too. And fair enough. I mean, why wouldn't it be? Because like they've done it for a long time and they were reasonably high level and so on and so forth. But like it's incredibly rare for someone who does not have that background, who didn't do high school debate, to be especially competitive now.
Well, so Gabe and Alex, are you seniors right now? Both of you? So yeah, Paul's perspective does bring in a lot of issues of like people starting at different times, and then, you know, like you have a very limited time to debate against each other. But I guess from your perspective, like how does it feel to, I feel like so often it's like, again, debate is weird. I guess a lot of college activities are, because it's like, well, the seniors have by far the best shot at winning, but then they kind of are done right after, right? You don't get to like have someone have a prime. You either like get there enough soon enough, or you like don't get there. But you never see people like hit their stride where they are the best and then fall off eventually, as other people adapt to that or catch up, or that person loses their skill. What's your perspective on that right now with leaving forensics, but also knowing that when you were competing, you got to be a sort of fresh team, right? You got to be a part of like a fresh season with new squads and stuff like that. How do you, what are your thoughts? I'd love to know.
To answer your other question a little bit more directly and this one tangentially, I don't think that the time limit decreases the quality of debates. I think that the quality of debates at the highest level are still incredibly good. So I don't think that that artificial time limit, and yes, it's incredibly artificial, but I don't think that artificial time limit like hampers the ability for debates to be high level and incredibly technical. As for the, coming down from a prime, I am not really sure what that would look like in debate. So I'm not exactly sure like how to engage in the counterfactual per se. Like, do I think that there are like, and the other thing is that like debate, the prime of debate seems like it would be, and let me pontificate here. It wouldn't be so much, primes in like athletics where, people's bones start to fail. It would be changes in the meta and like individuals who can't keep up with certain meta shifts. But if somebody were to like spend, a full-time job's worth in debate, like I think that like Paul right now could probably wax us, and I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt, Gabe.
I appreciate that. It means a lot.
But like I don't.
That's
know.
This video is gonna be 7 seconds long when we release it.
You should do that.
That's the intro.
Yeah.
There's no shot.
The like, is there an upper limit to getting good at debate? That's the question. And I don't know what it is beyond like the literal physical limitations of your lungs once you can't go fast enough.
But, I was watching this video earlier today and somebody was asking Lil Wayne, like, how do you stay relevant in music for so long? And he was like, oh, you just go on like the iTunes top 100 and whatever they're doing, you got to do that. Like, it doesn't matter like what you think people should do, or I do this, they do that, just whatever those people are doing, just do that. And I feel like music is a really good analog, better than sports, because it's in a way it's like a choice, but like, is it really? Like, can Willie Nelson choose to be relevant to music today? Like, in a way, yes, but practically, like, he has a skill set and he has a thing that he does and he has a style and he has emotional attachments to certain things. So I think it might be a little bit more like that in the long run for debate, compounded a little bit by like lung capacity, skill, flowing, whatever. But I think
the difference is music is not a contest though, right? What defines the best is whether or not you're winning or losing rounds. Like music changes hands and it changes, people's tastes change. And like, yes, there is an element to that in judging, as judges will change and what is perceived as good will change. But I don't think that like that analog is a perfect analogy, because offense will probably stay as offense. A link turn will probably stay as a link turn.
Right, but music isn't a contest to me and my one fan in Alley, but it is to like literally they have the Grammys, right? They have the rankings of, the album sales, right? And I think that introduces like another parallel to what you were both talking about earlier, that like not everybody treats it as this, even debate, no, but not everybody treats it as this like big contest. As people are here, they're trying to do this activity, they're not necessarily concerned with winning, which is maybe how a lot of people approach music. But
all right, I like have to wrap in the next like few minutes, so let's do like the survey questions, Sasan, or whatever the term for.
Great.
You have a
survey question.
Exit survey.
Gabe, would you describe this experience as good, very good.
Like,
No, it's the same questions that I asked Ali. I think the first we'll start with Gabe. We'll move to Alex. Gabe, just what is everyone but you wrong about in debate?
This is kind of like similar to Ali's perspective on like everything being an opportunity cost to the affirmative and not like a counter plan or counter advocacy. But I think that as a logical conclusion of every like conditional counter plan or counter advocacy actually just trying to prove an opportunity cost to the affirmative, that as a result, the AF should always be able to read an intrinsic perm, because if they're able to do something not germane to either the action of the AF or the counter plan that solves the net benefit, then there is no opportunity cost, even if it's like something completely different. That's my take, and I will always vote for an intrinsic perm.
try and keep that in mind. Alex.
Alex.
Or I don't know if you want to do the second one first for Gaber.
No. We'll stay on that. Alex, what's your like everyone but you is wrong about this?
Gabe is a better speaker than me. That's my first.
I won this year, so
yeah. Okay. Well,
Well, that's just math.
yeah. The other one, my real one, is that the hedge debate is the best debate possible.
I knew this was gonna be it.
Yeah.
Tell me more. Why?
It's the same reason why Marx is the best K. It's because there are so many people that have written about it. And I think this is like number one from a strategic standpoint. Debaters are bad at answering hedge, which means that more debaters should be reading hedge because, that wins. But also because like the depth of theory and like the depth of different types of realism, the different types of international like theories is vast and underutilized.
What's funny is
when we were waiting real quick, when we were waiting for awards and they were like back at Alex's apartment, I think Alex is just pulling like books out of his backpack and it's just like 4 different Mersheimer books on like hedge. And I'm just like, you need 4 for this guy? 4 books like just on you?
Well, what's funny is, I coach middle schoolers and they like inevitably find out like the K exists and they want to be good at it and whatever. What's funny is like hearing the people who are like genuinely very good at this versus like the kids that are like trying to be the world's best novice LD debater, is their approach is always like obscurity. Right? It's always like, oh, this is a really good cake because nobody's heard of this thing. This is like the macaroni and cheese salad K. But like your answer is the exact opposite, right? Like this is the best because there is so much literature on it and it's so well known. And I wish more young debaters would like process and understand that like you don't get good at debate by like saying something your opponent hasn't heard before, and that and like that debaters like you will never lose to rounds like that, right? Like how often do you lose a round just because somebody said something and you're like, this is my first time hearing that and I have no idea how to respond. Like like
Once.
never, right?
Once?
We lost against Lewis and Clark anyway.
Question 2 though. Who's
Question 2 is who would you at this point say helped you? We're national champions, right? Who helped you become a national champion that doesn't know it?
Well, and to be clear on this, they did give thank yous.
Right,
So
I understand that, but
that means this person was left out. I just want to make sure.
But that doesn't necessarily. I guess the point that I'm trying to get to is, like it's not necessarily like who played the biggest role in you succeeding. That doesn't know it. It's whose role like was something that is just sort of like tangential to how we normally think of a role in someone's success.
I got a good one. I did thank this person, but I would have to say Adeja, because Adeja and Mitch, but they beat us so badly our sophomore year in that NPTE semis round. It was legitimately the like worst I ever felt after a loss. It was the worst I ever felt after like my own speeches. They juked us so hard, and like that was like probably the lowest point in my debate career at all. And I think like it was such a bad experience. Like it's not a terrible experience because it's debate. You have fun, you're with your friends, but like as far as debate goes, it's probably the worst experience. And it shaped like how I thought about competing and how I thought about like my role as a competitor, and then like how I thought about like getting juked on an argument that I didn't expect, and it never happened again. And I think that really like changed my debate career. I think if we like somehow I think if we like lose that round, but it's not as embarrassing, I think like the next 2 years probably look a little different for me.
You have you seen Whiplash?
Yeah.
That's the story of the symbol or the chair or whatever getting thrown at Charlie Parker's head, right? Like
Mhm.
that's the like it sets a set of stakes, and you understand that like, oh, failure can happen and it can feel really bad, and
Mhm.
you get and not being shielded from that was I have another thought to add to that, but I wonder what Alex's answer is, and then I might
Mine's a little different. Mine's from high school.
Go ahead.
And it's George Lee.
Yeah.
George Lee gave a lecture on ethos at the GDI in like 2016. Best lecture I've ever heard. And like when I think about like debate lectures that stick in my mind, it's George Lee's debate ethos lecture at the GDI in 2016. I did not thank George Lee because going through every single lab leader that I've ever had would be a monumentous task, and you've already made fun of me for that, Paul. Thanking everybody in my thank yous.
One thing that was really interesting about Gabe and Ali's answers, you both thanked competitors. You both thanked competitors that beat you. And I think that says a lot about, you know, the ethos of being a high level competitor, tying in the word ethos also. That's why they pay me the big bucks.
I mean, Jordan wouldn't have been Jordan if he didn't get beaten by the Bad Boys Pistons, you know?
Right. And Bad Boys 2 wouldn't have been Bad Boys 2 if not for Bad Boys 1. I saw the documentary. I actually understood that reference. Dennis Rodman, Pistons. He went over to their team. But that's it. I'm gonna let Paul wrap it up.
It was great. I appreciate you two so much for being on here and just for talking shit in the Discord, and you know, being awesome people who I got to hang out with and watch debate and whatnot. And
Paul, you're telling me if there was a piece of paper in front of you, you could read it right now?
Yeah.
Like
this is like a very well lit room on my end.
No shot.
Dude, it's crazy. Like, I can't even like, I don't even know. Like, dude, it's so hard to like.
Paul, your exposure just adjusted to your phone.
Yeah, dude, I don't know. But yeah, anywho, thanks so much for being here, guys. I gotta call it a night. I also have a wife. Thanks also Sasan for rushing home from work and whatnot to make.
Oh no, hey, it was really cool to meet you guys. We've been talking about getting a chance to chat sometimes. I really appreciate you taking the time to come talk to us.
All right, well, we'll talk to everyone later. Have a good one, folks.
All right.
See ya.
Bye.
See ya.